Andrew Branca is joining us. He is an attorney specializing in self-defense law, founder of lawofselfdefense.com, and knows this subject quite well. He's been watching the trial up in Minnesota. And Andrew, with the way you just explained just the requirements to hit all of these charges, I just don't see the juror. I mean, I'm a guy, I almost died from fentanyl. I had surgery, they gave me fentanyl afterwards, and I swear to you, it almost killed me. It just makes your breathing so shallow that you just die. He was on that. I don't know how much, but he was on fentanyl, which already puts you close to death. Then he was fighting and everything else. Even I would look at what Chauvin did in the last 90 seconds, as you point out, and say, why didn't he react differently? If he would have reacted differently, maybe, but without that question answered, I don't see anybody saying that he didn't commit this felony.
That Chauvin didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah. Well, just that one thing. But that doesn't mean that I agree with second-degree murder.
Well, first of all, the legal standard is not that Chauvin didn't do anything wrong. Chauvin could have done something wrong and still not be guilty of a crime. The requirement is that his conduct was reasonable under the circumstances, not that it was perfect. If he made imperfect decisions, that's not criminal. That's just being a human being. So it's possible, if you ask Chauvin, I'm sure he'd say, well, I would do things differently the second time around, knowing that this was an outcome. But in the moment, facing a very large, non-compliant suspect they'd just been fighting with moments ago, who, as far as he knew, at least until the last 90 seconds, was moving, was breathing, was still alive, had no reason to think he was suddenly going to expire in the last 90 minutes before the paramedics showed up. They're dealing with a hostile, threatening crowd. There's radio chatter. There's road traffic. Right. This was a complex, dynamic situation. They weren't in a hotel lobby by themselves. Correct. Dealing with George Floyd. It was a much more hectic situation. And all of that totality of the circumstances has to be taken into account. And again, the question is not that Chauvin make perfect decisions. No one's required to make perfect decisions. The question is, did he make reasonable decisions under the totality of those circumstances?
All right. When you when I was a juror, the judge's directives at the end, when he gives the jury instructions, that you really kind of go by that when you go into the jury room. At least we did when I was on a jury. What did the judge say? And do you think he made anything easier or harder for this jury?
Well, I think he left a real area of ambiguity that's critical to this case, and he did not clarify that for the jury, and I think that's going to be a real problem. And that ambiguity is this issue of causation. What does it mean for Chauvin to have caused Floyd's death? And the way causation normally comes up is very straightforward. If I threaten you with a gun and say, give me all your money, and you jump backwards in fear, and you jump into the path of a bus, I didn't literally physically kill you, but I caused your death. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You would not have jumped back but for the fact that I was committing a crime. What I'm not responsible for in causation is things that you bring to the event that are not within my control. In this case, the real question is, did Chauvin cause Floyd's death when Floyd brought to that situation a 90% blocked coronary artery, enlarged heart, cancer, fentanyl addiction, meth levels? Chauvin didn't create any of that. So is he responsible for that? The prosecution is saying yes, in effect. The prosecution is saying, hey, that's part of the package. We're not required to disprove those things as a cause of death. The defense is saying, literally, they said to the jury, you are required to disprove those things. And obviously, that makes a huge difference whether the prosecution is or is not required to disprove those other causes of death. And the judge did nothing to clarify that question for the jury. And I'm a legal expert, and I don't know what the jury's supposed to do.
So if they can't disprove them, then that's the reasonable doubt, right?
For sure. If the prosecution is required to disprove those other things as a cause of death, then I think it's an easy acquittal. But I don't think anybody knows if that's what they're supposed to do.
So you said yesterday after the closing arguments, the prosecution got up, and you said they made things up, distorted reality, which you can't do. You can't bring up new things in the closing argument. There are real rules to closing arguments. What did they do that you found so egregious?
So the biggest thing that the defense objected to was that Prosecutor Blackwell got up there and basically called the defense liars, basically said they're fabricating their narrative for the jury. They told untruths throughout their closing statement. And here's the thing. If you're a prosecutor, you're not allowed to tell the jury that the other side is lying. If you're a civil plaintiff, you are allowed to do that. And guess what? Jerry Blackwell, who was a prosecutor in this case, did that rebuttal at the end. He's not normally a prosecutor. He's a civil litigator who was brought into this case for political purposes. And he acted like a civil litigator is allowed to act. The other side's lying. As a prosecutor, you're not allowed to do that. That is prosecutorial misconduct. And that's why Nelson moved for a mistrial, which was denied, of course. But I think it's certainly grounds for a mistrial because he did it not once, not twice, but 20 times over the course of a 45-minute rebuttal. So on average, every 2 minutes, he was calling the defense liars. And that's
so wait a minute, wait. When did the objection come, or can you object in closing arguments?
Nelson, you can. You don't want to because it looks horrible and the judge doesn't like it. But Nelson objected at least 3 times during the closing. And the first time, the judge basically ignored him. The second time, he told Blackwell stop calling it a story, and he kept doing it. And then Nelson objected a third time, told him again to stop calling it a story, stop calling it a fabrication, and he kept doing it anyway. And so when it was finally done, when the jury was out of the room, the defense made a motion for a mistrial on that basis. The judge denied it, but it's certainly going to be a grounds for appeal. Okay,
so help me out on this part of it. You know, Maxine Waters came in and said you should tear the city apart. One of the guys who was actually a defense witness came out and testified on Chauvin's behalf. They just found a severed pig head on his doorstep. I know that, you know, the jury's not supposed to watch news or anything else, but I can guarantee you everybody in the family of all of those jurors are saying, wait a minute. Honey, I mean, our family is in danger here. Are you aware of all of this stuff? I mean, how do you get a fair trial with this kind of stuff going on? What are the jurors going through right now?
Right. Well, you can't get a fair trial under these circumstances. It's impossible. There ought not be a trial occurring right now. It ought to be continued, which the defense has made motions for from the beginning. There ought to be a change in venue, which the defense has made motions for from the beginning. But for anyone who doubts whether or not there could be a fair trial here, just reverse the races of the people involved. If this was a black defendant and there was a mob of KKK outside the courthouse every day and threats of violence against the witnesses for this black defendant, would we say that was a fair trial? Of course not. It would be outrageous. So to suggest that simply because the defendant here happens to be white, this is a fair process for him is ridiculous.
What does the sentence look like for him if he's found guilty?
It's the rest of his life in prison for all practical purposes.
Does he stand a chance of survival in prison?
Well, he'd be in isolation for the rest of his life. So
for the rest of his life? That's cruel, unusual punishment, isn't it?
I would think so. Certainly the international courts consider isolated imprisonment to be a form of torture explicitly. But I think the longest sentence he's looking at is 40 years. So given his age, that's effectively the rest of his life in prison. Plus, the prosecution is looking for an additional aggravated sentencing on top of what the sentence normally carries, presumably because the crimes would have been committed while he was an officer of the law.
Wow. So if you if this guy is found guilty on all three, he's looking at a minimum of how long?
I believe it's 40 years, so it would be whatever
the minimum
sentence is. Yeah. Well, no, that's the maximum he's facing.
The maximum.
The minimum, I don't know what the sentencing range is, so I don't know what the judge's discretion is in the case. I always assume if it's my client that they might get hit with the max. So that's always the risk we take into consideration. But I'm not sure what discretion the judge has. Frankly, whatever legal discretion he might have, he may not have much political discretion, and he may not be interested in taking the heat that would come from giving this guy a lesser sentence than he has the legal right to give him.
Isn't this the worst possible outcome of everything that we try to do in America with our justice system? I mean, this is horrible.
Listen, it's a tragedy on all fronts. It's a tragedy that Floyd died. I'm sure everyone would prefer that George Floyd was still alive with his family. It's the whole thing is a tragedy, and we all wish it hadn't happened. Unfortunately, I don't think we're making things better by the process that we're trying to resolve what happened.
Thank you so much, Andrew. By the way, if they come out today, that's not good for him, right? If they come back quickly,
I would think that's not good, given the dynamics around this case now.
Okay. Thanks so much, Andrew. I appreciate it. God bless.
Sure thing. Take care.